Welcome to History Teller YT. In today's exploration, we embark on a profound journey into the heart of the Andean Mountains, where the echoes of ancient civilizations still resonate through the voices of today's indigenous youth. From the majestic heights of the Inca Empire to the modern-day struggles for land, culture, and rights, this history is both timeless and urgent. We'll delve into the stories of those who continue to fight for the preservation of their ancestral lands and traditions, while also pushing for justice, environmental sustainability, and self-determination in the face of modern challenges. As we uncover the struggles and triumphs of indigenous youth, you'll see how their efforts are shaping the future, not only for their communities, but for the world. So, sit back, immerse yourself in the powerful narrative of resilience, and discover how the legacies of the past are being carried forward today. By the end, you'll see how these young leaders are turning their histories into the blueprint for a better tomorrow. However, as modern industries have increasingly encroached upon these lands, indigenous leaders have emerged as key defenders of the environment, leading movements for climate justice and sustainable development. One such initiative is the Andean Pact of Indigenous Environmental Defenders, a coalition of indigenous groups in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador who are working together to safeguard their ecosystems and advocate for policy changes to address environmental issues. These groups have organized grassroots movements to challenge large-scale development projects, such as mining and hydroelectric dams, which threaten their water sources, forests, and agricultural land. Through protests, legal challenges, and international lobbying, these indigenous leaders have raised global awareness about the importance of preserving the Andean ecosystem, which is not only home to indigenous communities, but also vital for climate regulation in the region. One of the most prominent indigenous leaders in this movement is Tarsila Rivera-Z, a Peruvian activist and leader of the Andean Federation of Indigenous Women. She has been a staunch advocate for the rights of indigenous women, environmental protection, and sustainable development. Rivera-Z has worked with both local communities and international organizations to promote indigenous knowledge as a critical component of climate change mitigation strategies. Her work highlights how indigenous environmental practices, such as the preservation of traditional farming techniques and the protection of sacred forests, can offer solutions to modern environmental crises. Indigenous communities in the Andes also practice agroecology, which integrates traditional knowledge with modern ecological principles to create farming systems that are sustainable and resilient to climate change. These agricultural systems rely on diverse crop rotations, soil conservation, and water management techniques that have been developed over centuries. By using these sustainable methods, Andean farmers are able to maintain the health of their land while increasing their resilience to extreme weather events, such as droughts or floods, which have become more frequent due to climate change. In addition to protecting their own lands, indigenous communities in the Andes are also calling for global policies that promote environmental justice. The Andean Environmental Defenders Network, for example, works to bring attention to the harmful impacts of mining and oil extraction on the region's natural resources. These industries often ignore the rights of local communities, causing deforestation, soil contamination, and the depletion of freshwater resources. By advocating for international frameworks that hold governments and corporations accountable, indigenous leaders in the Andes are playing a crucial role in shaping global conversations about environmental sustainability. Indigenous peoples in the Andes are increasingly recognized as key actors in the fight against climate change, particularly due to their traditional ecological knowledge, TK, which has been developed and refined over thousands of years. This knowledge includes an understanding of local weather patterns, agroforestry techniques, and biodiversity management, which are crucial for climate adaptation. Indigenous practices have long been based on a profound connection to the land and a deep understanding of the environmental rhythms and cycles that sustain life in the Andean region. The importance of indigenous knowledge in climate change mitigation became particularly evident during the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP21, in Paris, where indigenous leaders from the Andes played an active role in advocating for the inclusion of their knowledge in global climate strategies. At COP21, the Indigenous Peoples Global Summit on Climate Change presented a unified call for the inclusion of indigenous rights and perspectives in climate change policies. Indigenous leaders emphasized the need for community-led conservation efforts, land rights, and sustainable resource management, which could contribute significantly to global climate goals. One of the key areas where indigenous knowledge has contributed to climate change mitigation is in the field of forestry. Indigenous communities in the Andes have traditionally managed forests through sustainable logging and agroforestry practices, which balance the need for wood and other resources with the health of the ecosystem. These practices are now being recognized as essential to the global effort to reduce deforestation and promote carbon sequestration. Indigenous managed forests in the Andes are often more biodiverse than those managed by corporations or the state, making them more resilient to environmental stresses such as droughts and pests. Another significant contribution is water management. Indigenous peoples in the Andes have developed sophisticated techniques for managing water resources in a high-altitude environment. Through the construction of irrigation systems and the careful management of water basins, they have been able to maintain agricultural productivity and mitigate the effects of seasonal droughts. As the region faces increasing water scarcity due to climate change, these traditional practices are being rediscovered and integrated into modern water management policies. The Quechua and Aymara peoples, who have lived in the Andes for centuries, are also experts in soil conservation. Their use of terracing and other soil preservation techniques has allowed them to cultivate crops in the steep mountain landscapes without degrading the land. These ancient practices are now being used as models for sustainable agriculture in other parts of the world. The resilience of Andean indigenous communities to climate change is rooted in their ability to adapt to shifting environmental conditions while maintaining sustainable and ecologically sound practices. International recognition of the role of indigenous knowledge in climate change mitigation has led to greater collaboration between indigenous leaders and governments, NGOs, and the scientific community. Indigenous leaders are increasingly being invited to climate policy discussions and conservation initiatives, where their knowledge is being integrated into global climate strategies. This recognition is essential in ensuring that indigenous communities are not only seen as victims of climate change, but as active participants in its solution. Indigenous movements in the Andes, as well as across Latin America, have become crucial players in the development of global environmental policy. Their leadership in environmental justice, sustainable development, and climate change mitigation is increasingly influencing global dialogues and shaping international policy. The climate justice framework, which is central to indigenous movements, highlights the disproportionate impact of climate change on marginalized communities, particularly those living in close connection with the land. One of the major goals of indigenous movements is to ensure that international climate policies are inclusive and recognize the rights and needs of indigenous peoples. Indigenous leaders have called for climate action that respects indigenous land rights, cultural practices, and self-determination, which are often ignored in conventional development and conservation initiatives. As indigenous communities continue to push for these changes, their movements are influencing major international agreements, such as the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol, both of which have increasingly recognized the importance of indigenous knowledge in combating climate change. In the Andes, the Intercultural and Indigenous Peoples Conference on Climate Change, held in 2019 in Ecuador, brought together indigenous leaders, environmental organizations, and governmental representatives to discuss the role of indigenous peoples in addressing climate change. This conference, held in the heart of the Andes, underscored the growing recognition of indigenous knowledge and leadership in the global environmental movement. The conference called for a stronger commitment to climate justice, urging nations to adopt policies that prioritize the needs of indigenous peoples in climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. Indigenous-led movements have also contributed to shaping policies on biodiversity conservation. In the Andean region, the Mountain Partnership, a global initiative supported by the United Nations, has incorporated indigenous practices into its strategies for mountain biodiversity conservation. The recognition of the Andes as a key biodiversity hotspot has led to collaborations between indigenous leaders and international conservation organizations, who are now integrating indigenous knowledge into strategies for the preservation of the region's unique ecosystems. In Peru, the National Association of Andean and Amazonian Indigenous Peoples of Peru, ANPIPA, has played an important role in advocating for the inclusion of indigenous voices in national policy discussions on climate change. ANPIPA has worked with government agencies and environmental groups to ensure that the rights of indigenous peoples are protected while pursuing sustainable environmental goals. This collaboration has been instrumental in pushing for policies that recognize the traditional knowledge of indigenous communities, as well as their role in biodiversity conservation and carbon sequestration. The fight for indigenous sovereignty in the Andes is not only about protecting lands and resources, but also about gaining the right to self-determination and autonomy. Sovereignty, in the context of indigenous movements in South America, refers to the right of indigenous peoples to govern themselves, make decisions about their lands, and control their cultural practices without interference from national governments or multinational corporations. This struggle is deeply rooted in the colonial history of South America, where indigenous peoples were not only dispossessed of their lands, but also denied their autonomy and cultural practices. For centuries, indigenous peoples in the Andes have been subjected to colonization, assimilation policies, and discrimination, which have stripped them of their traditional forms of governance and social structures. The Spanish conquest left a legacy of cultural suppression, where the Spanish sought to impose their own religion, language, and political systems upon the indigenous populations. Even after gaining independence, many Andean countries failed to recognize the rights and autonomy of their indigenous populations, continuing a system of marginalization and exclusion. In the 20th and 21st centuries, however, indigenous peoples in the Andes have increasingly mobilized to demand autonomy and the recognition of their sovereign rights. The movement for self-determination has gained traction in countries like Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador, where indigenous populations make up a significant portion of the population. The election of Evo Morales as the first indigenous president of Bolivia in 2006 was a milestone in this struggle, symbolizing the potential for indigenous peoples to reclaim political power and self-governance. Under Morales, Bolivia made significant strides toward recognizing indigenous rights, including the adoption of a new constitution that recognizes Bolivia as a plurinational state, acknowledging the rights of indigenous nations and their autonomy within a national framework. In Peru, the struggle for sovereignty continues, particularly in the Amazon and Andean highlands, where indigenous communities are fighting for control over their land and natural resources. Many of these communities have historically been denied access to decision-making processes and have been excluded from the political sphere. However, organizations like CONAP, National Confederation of Peruvian Communities, and ONPIAP, National Organization of Andean and Amazonian Indigenous Peoples of Peru, are working to strengthen the political power of indigenous peoples. These organizations advocate for the recognition of indigenous territorial rights, the right to cultural preservation, and the right to participate in governance without interference from corporate or state interests. Indigenous sovereignty is closely tied to the struggle for land rights, as the ownership and control of land are key elements in maintaining cultural identity, economic stability, and environmental health. For many indigenous groups, land is not just a physical resource. It is a spiritual and cultural asset that holds deep significance for future generations. Thus, the fight for land rights and self-governance is inseparable. The demand for autonomy means not only the right to protect lands from outside exploitation, but also the right to manage their resources in ways that are sustainable and culturally appropriate. The struggle for sovereignty is also about revitalizing traditional governance systems. Indigenous communities in the Andes have long had their own systems of leadership, decision-making, and dispute resolution, rooted in their cultural values and practices. These systems were suppressed by colonial authorities, but have persisted in various forms. Today, indigenous communities are seeking to reinstate these traditional systems of governance, ensuring that decisions about land, culture, and resources are made by the people who have the closest relationship with the land. A crucial aspect of the fight for indigenous sovereignty and rights in the Andes is the right to education. Education has historically been a tool of assimilation, used by colonial powers to impose foreign languages, cultures, and values upon indigenous peoples. In Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, the Spanish language and Christianity were forcibly introduced, and indigenous languages, including Quechua, Aymara, and Shur, were suppressed. These historical injustices have left deep scars, with many indigenous communities still struggling to regain their cultural identity and language. In the present day, the struggle for culturally relevant education has become a major component of the indigenous rights movement. Indigenous peoples are advocating for education systems that respect and incorporate their languages, cultures, and worldviews. In countries like Bolivia, the plurinational constitutional reform has made strides in promoting bilingual education, ensuring that indigenous languages are taught in schools alongside Spanish. However, implementation remains uneven, and indigenous communities continue to fight for greater control over their educational systems. Education is not just about learning indigenous languages. It is also about the right to teach and preserve indigenous knowledge. In many Andean communities, traditional ecological knowledge, passed down through generations, is at risk of being lost. Indigenous knowledge systems are invaluable in addressing global challenges such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and sustainable resource management. Education, therefore, is not just about survival. It is about thriving by ensuring that future generations can continue to pass on their knowledge and culture. Indigenous-led education initiatives are becoming more common in the Andes, with communities organizing schools that prioritize indigenous ways of knowing and living. These schools are based on the idea of holistic education, where students learn not just through textbooks, but also through direct engagement with the environment, agriculture, and traditional crafts. Indigenous leaders are pushing for the formal recognition of these schools and curricula in national education systems. The Andean Indigenous University in Ecuador, for example, is an initiative that integrates indigenous knowledge in Western academia, allowing students to learn in a way that respects both traditions. In Peru, indigenous peoples' schools, Escuelas de los Pueblos Indígenas, are working to ensure that young people learn in an environment that nurtures their identity, language, and cultural heritage. These initiatives are vital for promoting indigenous self-determination and providing future leaders with the tools they need to continue the fight for sovereignty and environmental justice. The development of culturally relevant curricula is seen as a form of cultural preservation, ensuring that future generations of indigenous peoples are well equipped to advocate for their rights. As indigenous movements in the Andes continue to gain momentum, they're not only shaping national policies, but also becoming an integral part of global movements for environmental justice, human rights, and decolonization. The struggles of indigenous peoples are increasingly seen as central to the broader fight against global capitalism, climate change, and environmental degradation. Indigenous leaders are drawing connections between the exploitation of their lands and the global systems that drive ecological destruction, economic inequality, and social injustice. The global indigenous rights movement has grown significantly in the last few decades, and solidarity among indigenous groups across the world is stronger than ever. Indigenous peoples from the Amazon rainforest to the Arctic are standing together to protect their lands, cultures, and rights. Indigenous-led movements, such as Standing Rock in the United States, have gained international attention, highlighting the common struggles of indigenous communities to defend their territories from exploitation by corporations and governments. In the Andes, indigenous movements have been instrumental in advocating for global policies that recognize and protect indigenous rights. Their activism has brought attention to issues such as free, prior, and informed consent, land restitution, environmental justice, and sustainable development. By connecting their local struggles to global issues, indigenous leaders in the Andes are helping to shape international policy on climate change, human rights, and biodiversity conservation. International solidarity is also playing a crucial role in amplifying indigenous voices. NGOs and human rights organizations around the world have been vital in advocating for the protection of indigenous lands and cultures. Campaigns, legal support, and global demonstrations have helped to raise awareness about the threats facing indigenous communities in the Andes and across the world. The growing support for the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, in international forums like the United Nations and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights underscores the global recognition of indigenous peoples as key actors in addressing the pressing challenges of our time. The movement for indigenous rights in the Andes is not just about protecting the past. It is about empowering indigenous communities to take control of their future. Through activism, education, and global solidarity, indigenous peoples are shaping a new narrative, one in which their voices are heard, their rights are respected, and their cultures are preserved for generations to come. As the struggles for indigenous rights in the Andes continue, international legal frameworks have played a significant role in shaping the battle for land, culture, and sovereignty. The development and enforcement of international law has become an important tool for indigenous groups seeking justice, particularly when national governments or powerful industries fail to respect indigenous rights. While the fight for indigenous sovereignty often begins at the local and national levels, the legal frameworks that exist on the global stage provide additional avenues for advocacy and resistance. One of the most important international legal frameworks for indigenous rights is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007. UNDRIP is a landmark document that outlines the rights of indigenous peoples globally, including the right to self-determination, land, cultural preservation, and participation in decision-making processes. While UNDRIP is not legally binding, it provides a moral and legal foundation for indigenous communities to challenge injustices and demand change at the international level. For example, Article 32 of UNDRIP states that indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands or territories. This provision has been instrumental in challenging projects that threaten indigenous land rights, such as hydroelectric dams, mining, and deforestation. Indigenous leaders from the Andes have used this framework to push back against large-scale projects that violate their right to free, prior, and informed consent, FPSC, which is enshrined in both UNDRIP and International Labor Organization, ILO, Convention number 169. In the Andes, particularly in Peru and Bolivia, Indigenous organizations have taken the fight for land rights and environmental protection to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, ICHR, the region's principal human rights body. The ICHR has ruled in favor of indigenous communities in several high-profile cases, reinforcing the principles of self-determination and land rights. For instance, in 2005, the ICHR ruled in favor of the Saramacca people of Suriname, recognizing their right to control their land and natural resources and setting a precedent for similar cases in other countries in Latin America. In Bolivia, the Constitutional Court has made significant strides in recognizing the collective rights of indigenous peoples, particularly in terms of their right to territory, self-governance, and participation in the political process. Bolivia's 2009 constitution is one of the most progressive in terms of indigenous rights, granting plurinational recognition, which acknowledges the country as a union of diverse indigenous nations, each with its own sovereignty and cultural identity. This recognition has been a direct result of indigenous movements in Bolivia and their long struggle for autonomy. Despite these legal advances, enforcement remains a challenge. The slow pace of change and the continued dominance of extractive industries in the Andes have made it difficult for indigenous communities to achieve meaningful results through legal channels alone. Many governments still prioritize economic development and corporate interests over the protection of indigenous rights, leading to ongoing struggles for indigenous communities to have their land rights respected in practice. The Andes region is rich in natural resources, including gold, silver, copper, and oil, making it an attractive area for multinational corporations seeking to exploit these resources. While the extraction of these resources has been a significant driver of economic growth for some countries, it has come at a great cost to indigenous communities, whose lands are often at the center of these projects. In many cases, the local communities are not consulted, and their lands are taken without their consent, resulting in displacement, environmental destruction, and cultural erosion. Mining activities, in particular, have been a major source of conflict between indigenous peoples and the state. The Minas Conga mining project in Cajamarca, Peru, is one such example. The project, proposed by a multinational corporation, would have led to the construction of large reservoirs and the extraction of gold from the area. However, the land is vital to the indigenous Quechua communities who rely on the land for farming and water. In response, local indigenous leaders organized protests and blockades to stop the project, arguing that it would lead to the destruction of vital water sources and disrupt their way of life. In 2011, after years of protests, the Peruvian government suspended the project. While this was seen as a victory for indigenous communities, the long-term impacts of such large-scale mining projects continue to pose a threat to the environment and indigenous livelihoods in the region. The case of Minas Conga highlights the growing tensions between the state's desire for economic development and the need to protect indigenous peoples' rights to land and resources. It also underscores the importance of free, prior, and informed consent, FPC, a principle recognized in both international law and UNDRIP, which requires governments and corporations to consult indigenous peoples before implementing development projects on their lands. Beyond mining, oil extraction and hydroelectric projects have also had devastating effects on indigenous communities in the Andes. In Ecuador, for example, the Coca-Codo-Sinclair Dam project has faced strong opposition from the Quechua people, who argue that the dam would flood their ancestral lands, displace communities, and threaten their water supply. Similarly, in Peru, indigenous communities in the Amazon have faced displacement due to oil exploration activities, leading to widespread protests and demands for greater protection of indigenous territories. The environmental impacts of these projects are profound. Mining and oil extraction often lead to deforestation, water contamination, and the destruction of biodiversity. For indigenous communities who rely on the land for agriculture, fishing, and traditional healing practices, these environmental changes are devastating. The loss of access to clean water and fertile soil has made it increasingly difficult for many indigenous communities to sustain their livelihoods. In response to these threats, indigenous communities in the Andes have increasingly turned to legal action, protests, and international solidarity campaigns to protect their lands and resources. They argue that the right to a healthy environment is integral to their survival, and that governments and corporations must respect their right to self-determination and land sovereignty. In recent decades, the indigenous resistance movements in the Andes have gained significant traction not only within national borders, but also on the international stage. Indigenous leaders and activists from the region have formed alliances with global environmental organizations, human rights groups, and solidarity movements that work together to amplify the voices of indigenous peoples. This global solidarity is critical in challenging the power dynamics that often favor corporate and state interests over the rights of indigenous communities. One notable example of international solidarity is the Standing Rock movement in the United States, where indigenous peoples and environmental activists from around the world came together to protest the Dakota Access Pipeline, DAPL. The movement emphasized the importance of water protection and the rights of indigenous peoples to protect their ancestral lands. The success of the Standing Rock protests, which drew widespread media attention, demonstrated the power of global indigenous solidarity and its potential to create meaningful change. Indigenous leaders from the Andes, including Tarsila Rivera Z from Peru, joined the protests in solidarity, highlighting the global nature of the struggle for indigenous rights. In the Andes, indigenous communities have formed their own networks of resistance that cross national borders. The Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, CONE, the National Confederation of Peasant, Agricultural, and Native Communities of Peru, CONACAMI, and the Bolivian Confederation of Indigenous Peoples have been at the forefront of advocacy for indigenous sovereignty and environmental protection. These organizations are united in their opposition to large-scale resource extraction projects and their commitment to preserving indigenous land rights. International environmental NGOs, such as Amazon Watch and Survival International, have been instrumental in supporting indigenous resistance to destructive projects in the Andes. These organizations help provide legal and financial support to indigenous communities, raise awareness about the environmental impacts of corporate exploitation, and hold governments accountable for their treatment of indigenous peoples. Their advocacy has led to increased media coverage and international pressure on governments to respect indigenous rights and land sovereignty. The role of international law and human rights treaties has also been critical in supporting indigenous movements. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, ICHR, has repeatedly ruled in favor of indigenous groups, granting them the right to free, prior, and informed consent regarding projects on their lands. While the enforcement of these rulings remains inconsistent, they represent important legal victories for indigenous peoples in their struggle for autonomy and sovereignty. Indigenous communities in the Andes have long been recognized as stewards of some of the world's most unique and biologically diverse ecosystems. Their deep connection to the land, coupled with millennia of traditional ecological knowledge, TK, has made them critical players in efforts to preserve the region's biodiversity and mitigate the impacts of climate change. The Andean highlands, from the snow-capped peaks of the Peruvian Andes to the lush, biodiverse forests of the Amazon basin, are home to a wide range of species that are essential to the region's ecological balance. Indigenous peoples, particularly those of the Quechua, Aymara, and Inca descent, have long managed these landscapes through sustainable practices, ensuring the preservation of both cultural and natural heritage. One of the most significant contributions of indigenous peoples in the Andes to biodiversity preservation is their sophisticated land management techniques. For example, terrace farming, developed by the Incas, is still in use today. These terraces, often carved into the steep slopes of the mountains, reduce soil erosion, conserve water, and allow for the cultivation of a variety of crops, such as potatoes, quinoa, and maize. This method of farming promotes biodiversity by allowing for the cultivation of multiple crops in close proximity, which support a variety of plant and animal species. In addition to agricultural practices, indigenous communities in the Andes have developed complex systems of agroforestry that combine forests and agriculture in a way that benefits both the environment and local communities. These systems are based on the principle of maintaining a balance between nature and human needs. Indigenous knowledge of local ecosystems, such as understanding how to manage water resources, protect soil health, and preserve native plant species, has proven to be essential in sustaining these delicate environments, especially in the face of growing environmental pressures like deforestation, climate change, and resource extraction. Unfortunately, these traditional practices are increasingly threatened by the encroachment of mining, oil extraction, and logging operations. In the Andean region, multinational corporations often exploit natural resources without considering the long-term ecological consequences. Deforestation, water contamination, and loss of biodiversity are just some of the outcomes of these destructive industries. As a result, indigenous communities have increasingly turned to their traditional ecological knowledge as a means to counter these threats and advocate for the preservation of their land and resources. In recent years, there's been a growing recognition of the importance of indigenous knowledge in global conservation efforts. International organizations, such as WWF and the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, are beginning to collaborate with indigenous communities to integrate their knowledge into formal conservation strategies. This partnership not only helps to preserve biodiversity, but also empowers indigenous peoples to play a central role in global discussions on climate change, sustainability, and environmental justice. The preservation of Andean biodiversity is not just a local issue, it is a global one. Many of the species found in the Andes, including the Andean condor, spectacled bear, and vicuna, are threatened by human activity. These species, along with countless plants and microorganisms, play an important role in maintaining ecological balance in the region. By supporting indigenous-led conservation efforts and recognizing their traditional ecological knowledge, the global community can help protect the natural resources that sustain both indigenous cultures and the world's biodiversity. The struggle for land rights in the Andes is deeply entwined with the broader forces of global capitalism and neoliberal development. Indigenous communities in countries like Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador are constantly fighting against the pressures of land privatization, resource extraction, and the expansion of industrial agriculture. These global forces, which prioritize short-term profits and economic growth over sustainability and human rights, often disregard the needs and rights of indigenous peoples. In the Andes, large-scale mining operations, hydroelectric dams, and oil exploration are central to the economic agendas of many national governments. These projects are often backed by foreign investment and multinational corporations that seek to exploit the region's rich natural resources. The extraction of gold, silver, oil, and natural gas from the Andes has led to widespread environmental degradation, including pollution, deforestation, and the destruction of vital ecosystems. For indigenous communities, this represents not only a threat to their environment, but also to their way of life. Many indigenous peoples in the Andes rely on the land for their livelihoods through subsistence farming, pastoralism, and hunting. The loss of access to these lands, often due to the expansion of resource extraction projects, puts their economic independence and cultural identity at risk. Furthermore, the environmental damage caused by mining and logging operations disrupts the ecosystems that indigenous peoples depend on for food, water, and medicinal plants. The issue of land rights in the Andes is also bound up in historical injustices. During the colonial era, indigenous peoples were forcibly dispossessed of their lands by Spanish settlers, and these patterns of land theft continued after independence. The latifundia system, where large estates were given to Spanish settlers and later wealthy elites, left indigenous communities without land or access to resources. Even today, the legal frameworks of many Andean countries continue to favor large corporations and landowners over the rights of indigenous peoples, who often lack legal recognition of their ancestral territories. Indigenous movements in the Andes have fought against this system for decades. Organizations such as the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, CONE, and the National Confederation of Peasant, Agricultural, and Native Communities of Peru, CONACAMI, have been at the forefront of land rights advocacy. These groups have pushed for legal reforms that would grant indigenous peoples formal recognition of their territorial rights, a process that is often slow and met with resistance from powerful economic interests. In Bolivia, the election of Evo Morales in 2006 marked a significant shift in the country's approach to land rights. Morales, who hails from the Aymara indigenous community, prioritized the redistribution of land to indigenous peoples, and his government enacted a series of reforms to address the historical injustices faced by Bolivia's indigenous populations. The 2010 Law of the Rights of Mother Earth, which recognizes the earth as a living being with rights, further solidified Bolivia's commitment to protecting indigenous lands and the environment. However, the implementation of these reforms has faced challenges, particularly in rural areas where land grabs by multinational corporations continue. Despite these challenges, the struggle for land rights in the Andes is not only about reclaiming land. It is also about reclaiming indigenous sovereignty. Indigenous peoples in the Andes are increasingly demanding the right to control their territories and resources without interference from outside actors. This struggle for sovereignty is a key aspect of the broader decolonization movement in Latin America, where indigenous communities are seeking to undo the effects of centuries of colonial oppression and assert their right to self-determination. The future of indigenous rights and environmental justice in the Andes is closely tied to the activism and leadership of indigenous youth. For many years, indigenous communities in the region have been led by elders and traditional leaders who have carried the struggle for sovereignty, land rights, and cultural preservation. However, as environmental challenges intensify and the need for political representation grows, indigenous youth have become increasingly involved in activism and leadership roles. Indigenous youth in the Andes are not only concerned with protecting their ancestral lands from external exploitation, but are also pushing for greater political representation, economic empowerment, and social justice. They are increasingly organizing movements to address issues such as climate change, racial discrimination, gender inequality, and education. These youth-led movements are helping to reshape the indigenous rights agenda, ensuring that the needs and aspirations of young people are heard and included in broader political conversations. One of the most prominent examples of indigenous youth activism in the Andes is the Youth Indigenous Movement of Bolivia, which has advocated for greater participation of indigenous youth in decision-making processes, particularly regarding environmental policy and land rights. This movement has been instrumental in pushing for the inclusion of indigenous youth in discussions on national policies related to climate change, education, and economic development. Indigenous youth in Bolivia have also been active in organizing protests and campaigns against resource extraction projects that threaten their communities and the environment. In Ecuador, indigenous youth have formed coalitions with environmental groups to combat deforestation in the Amazon and raise awareness about the impacts of oil extraction. The Youth Council of the Amazon has become an influential voice in Ecuador's national political discourse, advocating for policies that prioritize the rights of indigenous peoples and the protection of the environment. Indigenous youth are also playing a crucial role in reclaiming and revitalizing indigenous languages, cultures, and traditions. In many Andean communities, indigenous languages such as Quechua and Aymara are at risk of extinction. To combat this, young activists are creating language preservation programs, establishing cultural centers, and developing educational materials to ensure that indigenous languages and traditions are passed on to future generations. These efforts are crucial in maintaining the cultural integrity of indigenous communities and ensuring that indigenous identity remains strong in the face of globalization. As the struggles for indigenous rights, land sovereignty, and environmental justice continue, indigenous youth are increasingly taking leadership roles, bringing fresh perspectives and new energy to these movements. Their activism is essential in shaping the future of indigenous rights and ensuring that indigenous peoples remain active agents in the global fight for climate justice and human rights. As the struggles for land rights and environmental justice continue, indigenous youth in the Andes are increasingly stepping up to advocate for education that respects their cultural identity, language, and traditional knowledge. Education has long been a tool of assimilation and cultural suppression for indigenous peoples in the Andes. Colonial systems imposed foreign languages, religions, and worldviews, which led to the marginalization of indigenous cultures. The legacy of these policies is still felt today, as many indigenous communities in countries like Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador struggle to access quality education that honors their ancestral knowledge. For many indigenous youth in the Andes, the fight for education is deeply connected to the struggle for cultural revitalization. Indigenous youth are increasingly organizing around the need for an education system that values indigenous languages, history, and worldviews. In many Andean countries, Quechua, Aymara, and other indigenous languages are spoken by millions of people, but they are often excluded from formal education systems. In response to this, indigenous youth activists are working to create and promote bilingual and bicultural educational programs that integrate indigenous languages and cultural practices into the curriculum. In Bolivia, the plurinational constitution of 2009 recognized Bolivia as a country with multiple indigenous nations, and bilingual education was introduced as a constitutional right. However, there are still significant challenges in implementing these reforms, particularly in rural and remote indigenous communities. In many parts of the Andes, indigenous youth are advocating for school curricula that not only teach indigenous languages, but also incorporate indigenous science, agriculture, and environmental stewardship into the education system. This approach helps ensure that young people grow up with a deep understanding of their cultural heritage and can apply it to contemporary challenges. One of the most important aspects of indigenous youth-led educational initiatives is the reclamation of indigenous knowledge systems. Indigenous cultures in the Andes have developed sustainable agricultural practices, water management systems, and ecological wisdom that have allowed them to live in harmony with the land for thousands of years. These knowledge systems are vital in addressing global issues such as climate change, deforestation, and biodiversity loss. By integrating this traditional knowledge into educational frameworks, indigenous youth are ensuring that their communities remain resilient in the face of environmental challenges. Indigenous youth in Peru have also been active in creating their own educational initiatives. For example, the National Confederation of Andean and Amazonian Indigenous Peoples of Peru, CONAPIP, has partnered with local schools to offer programs that combine indigenous history, language, and sustainable farming practices with modern education. These efforts are helping to preserve indigenous cultural heritage and ensure that indigenous youth can grow up with both a strong connection to their roots and the tools they need to succeed in today's world. The push for culturally relevant education is also tied to social justice and empowerment. Many indigenous youth in the Andes are organizing cultural festivals, language immersion programs, and leadership training initiatives to help young people connect with their heritage and develop the skills necessary to advocate for their rights. By creating spaces for indigenous youth to learn about their culture, history, and environmental practices, these initiatives help foster a sense of pride and ownership over their traditions, reinforcing their role as active agents in the broader movement for indigenous self-determination. The growing involvement of indigenous youth in the fight for climate justice is one of the most powerful shifts in the Andes today. As the impacts of climate change become more pronounced in the region, such as shrinking glaciers, erratic rainfall, and increased temperatures, indigenous youth are increasingly taking leadership roles in advocating for solutions that are both sustainable and rooted in their traditional knowledge. In countries like Bolivia and Ecuador, indigenous youth have emerged as vocal advocates for climate change action, not only to protect their own communities, but to contribute to global climate efforts. They argue that their communities, which have lived sustainably for generations, have valuable insights into how to address the environmental crisis. They call for the adoption of traditional ecological practices alongside modern climate solutions to build a more sustainable future. In Bolivia, youth-led movements have been critical in advocating for Mother Earth rights, a concept enshrined in Bolivia's 2010 law of the rights of Mother Earth. This law recognizes that the Earth itself has rights, such as the right to life and the right to be free from environmental harm. Indigenous youth in Bolivia have been at the forefront of this movement, organizing events, protests, and campaigns to promote environmental conservation and highlight the impact of extractive industries on the environment. In Peru, indigenous youth have mobilized against destructive mining practices that threaten the Amazon rainforest and the Andean ecosystems. One example is the youth-led movement against the Camisea gas project, which has caused widespread deforestation and water contamination in the Amazon basin. Indigenous youth are fighting for a halt to the expansion of oil and gas drilling in these sensitive areas, calling for the preservation of the rainforest and Amazonian biodiversity. One of the most visible symbols of indigenous youth activism is their involvement in global climate strikes and protests. Indigenous youth leaders from the Andes have traveled to international conferences such as the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP, to demand that the rights of indigenous peoples be included in climate policies. In these forums, they highlight how indigenous communities are disproportionately affected by climate change, while contributing the least to its causes. They argue that indigenous knowledge systems, such as sustainable agriculture, water conservation, and forest management, offer vital solutions to the climate crisis. Indigenous youth are also working to address the intergenerational aspect of climate change. They are committed to ensuring that future generations inherit a world that is still capable of sustaining indigenous cultures and ways of life. This includes a focus on environmental education and the promotion of climate adaptation strategies that are aligned with traditional practices. These young activists see themselves as the future guardians of the planet and are determined to ensure that indigenous ways of living are recognized and valued in the global conversation about climate action. The growing involvement of indigenous youth in climate action is transforming the way we think about environmentalism and sustainability. Indigenous knowledge, which has long been dismissed by mainstream environmental movements, is now being acknowledged as a key component of climate solutions. Indigenous youth are ensuring that their communities are no longer sidelined in global environmental discussions and that their role as environmental leaders is recognized worldwide. The involvement of indigenous youth in the global movement for Indigenous rights marks a pivotal moment in the struggle for self-determination and justice. In the Andes, as well as across Latin America, Indigenous youth are increasingly connecting their local struggles with broader global movements for human rights, environmental justice, and social equality. They are no longer passive recipients of policy decisions made by governments and corporations. Instead, they're taking leadership roles, mobilizing their communities, and advocating for systemic change. The rise of Indigenous youth networks in the Andes has been facilitated by advances in technology and social media, which allow young activists to connect with one another across national and regional borders. Indigenous youth movements in the Andes are increasingly forming alliances with other youth-led environmental and human rights organizations. These collaborations have given Indigenous youth a global platform to advocate for climate justice, land rights, racial equality, and cultural preservation. One of the most prominent global platforms for Indigenous youth activism is the International Indigenous Youth Council, IYC, which has brought together young leaders from around the world, including the Andes, to share strategies, discuss challenges, and organize joint actions. Through their involvement in the IYC, Indigenous youth from the Andes have worked to strengthen their voices in global conversations on topics such as sustainable development, free, prior, and informed consent, and decolonization. In addition to organizing protests and campaigns, Indigenous youth are also engaged in policy advocacy. They are increasingly participating in international forums, such as the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, UNPFII, and the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, where they push for the implementation of global agreements like UNDRIP and the Paris Climate Agreement. By presenting their perspectives and experiences, Indigenous youth from the Andes are contributing to the creation of policies that more accurately reflect the realities of Indigenous communities. The role of Indigenous youth in global environmental movements has gained considerable momentum, especially as environmental degradation accelerates and climate change impacts Indigenous territories around the world. In the Andes, youth activists are increasingly seen as vital players in the fight for both environmental justice and the protection of Indigenous rights. These young leaders are actively engaged in pushing for sustainable solutions to global environmental challenges, drawing upon their communities' centuries-old knowledge of natural resource management, biodiversity conservation, and climate resilience. Indigenous youth from the Andes have been vocal in advocating for climate action, emphasizing the need for climate justice that addresses the disproportionate impacts on Indigenous communities, which are often the least responsible for environmental harm, but bear the brunt of its effects. As the effects of climate change, such as rising temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, and a shrinking of glaciers, severely impact the high-altitude environments of the Andes, Indigenous youth are increasingly stepping up to demand that their voices be heard in global climate discussions. The involvement of Indigenous youth in global forums, such as the United Nations Climate Change Conference's COP, marks a significant shift in how Indigenous rights are included in international climate policy. For example, Andean youth leaders have participated in climate negotiations, calling for climate policies that not only reduce carbon emissions, but also incorporate traditional ecological knowledge, TK, and sustainable land management practices that have long been integral to Indigenous ways of life. Indigenous youth from the Andes have formed alliances with other youth-led environmental groups, amplifying their calls for action on issues like deforestation, biodiversity loss, and the protection of water sources. One notable example of Indigenous youth leadership in the global environmental movement is the involvement of Peruvian youth in the Fridays for Future Climate Strike movement, founded by Greta Thunberg. Peruvian Indigenous youth, recognizing the deep connections between environmental degradation and social justice, have brought the issue of Indigenous land rights to the global stage, urging policymakers to respect indigenous communities' rights to land and resources. These young activists see climate change not just as an environmental crisis, but as a human rights crisis that disproportionately affects indigenous peoples who are already vulnerable due to economic inequality, discrimination, and historic dispossession. Furthermore, Andean indigenous youth have led efforts to incorporate their traditional farming techniques, such as agroecology, into climate change adaptation strategies. These techniques, developed over centuries, focus on sustainable farming that works in harmony with the environment, using crop rotation, soil conservation, and water management practices to mitigate the effects of climate change. Indigenous youth are pushing for the recognition of these practices in climate adaptation and sustainable agriculture policies, arguing that they offer valuable, time-tested solutions to modern environmental challenges. As the global community faces the reality of climate change, indigenous youth leaders from the Andes are advocating for policies that center indigenous knowledge and community-based solutions. They are working to ensure that their community's sustainable practices are recognized and integrated into global climate strategies, promoting not only environmental justice, but also the cultural survival of indigenous peoples. In addition to advocating for environmental justice and land rights, indigenous youth in the Andes are also at the forefront of social movements that address gender inequality, racial discrimination, and economic justice. For many years, indigenous women in the Andes have faced systemic barriers to participation in political, social, and economic life, often being excluded from leadership roles and denied access to resources and opportunities. This gender inequality is compounded by the broader structures of colonialism, patriarchy, and neoliberal economic policies that continue to marginalize indigenous peoples. Indigenous youth, particularly young women, have increasingly taken on leadership roles in challenging these structures and advocating for gender equality within their communities and beyond. They are breaking down traditional gender norms that have historically placed women in subordinate roles and are challenging both gender-based violence and economic exploitation. Indigenous youth-led organizations, such as the Andean Federation of Indigenous Women and the Indigenous Youth Network of Peru, are working to empower young women by providing them with leadership training, access to education, and platforms to advocate for their rights. One of the most notable areas where indigenous youth have made an impact is in the movement to combat gender-based violence within indigenous communities. Indigenous women in the Andes have historically been subjected to violence, not only within their families, but also by external actors, such as government forces and multinational corporations. Indigenous youth activists are organizing against this violence, pushing for legal reforms, better enforcement of human rights protections, and the inclusion of indigenous women's voices in national and international discussions on gender equality. In Bolivia, young Aymara women have become powerful advocates for the rights of indigenous women, pushing for affirmative action policies that ensure indigenous women are included in political representation and leadership positions. They have organized protests and campaigns aimed at eradicating patriarchy and empowering women to take on roles in political and economic decision-making. These efforts have been vital in bringing attention to the intersection of gender inequality and indigenous rights, ensuring that indigenous women's struggles are recognized as part of the broader movement for social justice. In Peru, indigenous youth groups are also challenging traditional gender roles by promoting education for indigenous girls, encouraging them to pursue careers in fields where they have traditionally been underrepresented, such as science, politics, and business. These groups are helping to break the cycle of poverty and discrimination that many indigenous girls face by advocating for policies that support gender equity in education and economic opportunities. By ensuring that young indigenous women are given the tools to succeed and lead, these movements are building a more inclusive and just future for all indigenous communities. Indigenous youth in the Andes are also recognizing the importance of intergenerational solidarity in addressing issues of gender inequality. They are working alongside older generations of indigenous women to ensure that the wisdom and knowledge of indigenous matriarchs are passed down to younger women, while also challenging the status quo and fighting for more inclusive decision-making processes. This collaboration between generations is a vital part of the broader struggle for gender equality, ensuring that indigenous women can take on leadership roles and help shape the future of their communities. Through these efforts, indigenous youth are not only advocating for gender equality within their own communities, but are also contributing to the broader global movement for women's rights and gender justice. By linking the fight for indigenous sovereignty with the struggle for gender equity, they're challenging the intersecting systems of oppression that affect both their communities and the global indigenous movement. The global indigenous rights movement has grown exponentially over the last few decades, with indigenous youth increasingly taking the lead in shaping its direction and pushing for greater recognition and protection of indigenous rights. This movement, which spans continents, has brought together indigenous people from the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Australia, uniting them in their shared struggle for land sovereignty, self-determination, and environmental justice. Indigenous youth activists are playing a crucial role in this global movement by connecting local struggles to broader global issues such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and decolonization. Youth-led initiatives like the International Indigenous Youth Council, IYC, and Youth for Indigenous Rights have given indigenous youth from the Andes a platform to voice their concerns and advocate for their rights. These organizations provide spaces for young indigenous activists to collaborate, share strategies, and learn from one another. They also offer leadership training and capacity-building programs to empower indigenous youth to take on leadership roles within their communities and on the global stage. The United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, UNPFII, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, have also played important roles in elevating the voices of indigenous youth in global conversations. These platforms have helped bring attention to the critical issues faced by indigenous communities worldwide, including the ongoing land dispossession, cultural assimilation, and human rights violations that many indigenous peoples continue to experience. Indigenous youth from the Andes have been active participants in these forums, pushing for stronger protections for indigenous territories and advocating for the inclusion of indigenous knowledge in global climate policies. The Global Indigenous Youth Caucus is another example of how indigenous youth are coming together to demand action. This platform allows indigenous youth leaders from the Andes and other regions to organize and advocate for policies that respect indigenous rights and address climate justice. At the COP climate conferences, youth activists have highlighted the importance of indigenous knowledge in climate adaptation strategies, calling for the integration of traditional ecological practices in global climate frameworks. These youth leaders argue that indigenous peoples have been at the forefront of sustainable living for millennia, and that their knowledge is critical in solving today's environmental challenges. As the global indigenous rights movement continues to grow, indigenous youth from the Andes are helping to shape the future of this movement, ensuring that their community struggles are not forgotten and that indigenous peoples remain central to the fight for environmental and social justice. Indigenous youth in the Andes are not only advocating for environmental justice and land rights, but they are also at the forefront of efforts to preserve and revitalize their cultural heritage. In many Andean communities, cultural identity is intrinsically tied to the land, language, and traditions that have been passed down through generations. However, centuries of colonialism, cultural suppression, and neoliberal development have posed serious threats to indigenous cultures. As a result, indigenous youth have taken on the task of safeguarding and revitalizing their cultural practices, ensuring that their heritage remains a vital part of their communities and their future. The preservation of indigenous languages is a key focus of many youth-led initiatives in the Andes. Languages such as Quechua, Aymara, and Mapudungun are integral to the cultural identity of indigenous peoples in the region, yet they are endangered due to historical efforts to assimilate indigenous populations into dominant national cultures. In Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, indigenous youth have been instrumental in promoting the use of their native languages in schools, media, and public life. This cultural revival is not just about linguistic preservation. It is also about reclaiming indigenous knowledge, which is often transmitted through language, including traditional ecological knowledge, medicinal practices, and agricultural techniques. One such initiative is the Quechua Language Revival Program in Cusco, Peru. Indigenous youth from Quechua-speaking communities have come together to develop educational materials, such as books, films, and radio programs, aimed at promoting the use of Quechua among younger generations. This program emphasizes the importance of language as a vehicle for cultural transmission, allowing youth to reconnect with their heritage and gain a deeper understanding of their history, traditions, and values. These initiatives also help to combat the stigma surrounding indigenous languages, which have long been viewed as inferior to Spanish in many Andean societies. In Bolivia, the Aymara language has similarly been revitalized through youth-led efforts. Aymara youth have worked with local schools and universities to introduce Aymara language classes and ensure that Aymara cultural practices are included in educational curricula. This push for bilingual education has been reinforced by Bolivia's plurinational constitution, which recognizes the country's indigenous languages as official languages alongside Spanish. These efforts have empowered youth to take pride in their cultural heritage, while also fostering a sense of ownership and responsibility for preserving indigenous traditions. Additionally, indigenous youth in the Andes are leading efforts to preserve traditional arts and crafts. Weaving, pottery, and textile arts are essential parts of Andean indigenous culture, but they are increasingly at risk of disappearing due to the dominance of mass-produced goods. In response, young artisans are organizing workshops and cultural festivals to teach younger generations the skills needed to create traditional crafts. These workshops are also helping to revive indigenous fashion traditions, such as the use of natural dyes and traditional weaving patterns, which are being incorporated into modern designs. By bridging the gap between traditional crafts and contemporary fashion, indigenous youth are ensuring that these cultural practices remain relevant and accessible in today's world. Through these initiatives, indigenous youth in the Andes are ensuring that their cultural identity remains alive and vibrant. They are actively reclaiming and reinvigorating their heritage, challenging the forces of cultural assimilation, and ensuring that future generations can continue to learn from the rich traditions of their ancestors. In addition to cultural revitalization, indigenous youth in the Andes are increasingly involved in political mobilization, fighting for self-determination, land rights, and social justice. While older generations of indigenous activists have fought for recognition and rights for decades, indigenous youth are bringing new energy and perspectives to these struggles. They are taking on leadership roles in grassroots movements and organizations, advocating for policies that address the challenges faced by indigenous communities in the face of globalization, climate change, and economic inequality. One of the key political demands of indigenous youth is the right to self-determination, which includes the freedom to govern their own territories, manage their resources, and make decisions about their future without interference from national governments or multinational corporations. In countries like Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, indigenous youth are increasingly organizing to demand that their communities have a say in the decisions that affect them, particularly when it comes to land use, resource extraction, and environmental policies. In Bolivia, The plurinational state framework, which recognizes Bolivia as a union of indigenous nations, has created opportunities for indigenous youth to take part in national politics. Indigenous youth have been instrumental in pushing for policies that ensure the full recognition of indigenous territories and the protection of natural resources. The success of the Movimiento al Socialismo, MAS, party, which was led by Evo Morales, has opened doors for indigenous youth to take part in the political process, and today, indigenous youth organizations of Bolivia are advocating for more inclusive governance that respects indigenous autonomy. In Peru, indigenous youth have formed powerful coalitions to challenge mining projects and oil exploration that threaten indigenous territories and the environment. The National Confederation of Andean and Amazonian Indigenous Peoples of Peru, CONAPIP, and other youth-led groups have organized protests and legal campaigns against the exploitation of indigenous lands by foreign corporations. These youth activists are calling for greater protections for indigenous territories, demanding that their communities be consulted before any development projects are undertaken on their land. Their activism has led to greater visibility for indigenous rights in national and international forums, and they continue to push for the recognition of indigenous youth as key decision makers in environmental and political matters. One of the most significant challenges indigenous youth face in the Andes is economic inequality. Many indigenous communities in the region are among the poorest in their countries, with limited access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities. Indigenous youth are advocating for economic justice, pushing for policies that promote equitable development, sustainable livelihoods, and the recognition of indigenous knowledge as a valuable resource in the global economy. They are also calling for the creation of job opportunities that respect indigenous cultures and traditions, allowing young people to stay in their communities while contributing to local economies. Indigenous youth in the Andes are redefining the future of indigenous political activism, ensuring that their voices are heard and their rights are recognized both nationally and globally. They are pushing for political systems that reflect their values, uphold their rights to land and self-governance, and offer solutions to the challenges of the 21st century. The intersectionality of gender, race, and indigenous identity is another critical aspect of the indigenous youth movements in the Andes. While indigenous peoples in the region have long been subjected to racial and economic discrimination, indigenous women and girls face additional barriers due to both their gender and ethnic identity. In many Andean communities, indigenous women are often excluded from positions of power and decision-making, with traditional gender roles limiting their opportunities in education, politics, and the workforce. Indigenous youth activists are increasingly addressing these issues by fighting for gender equality and racial justice within their communities. Indigenous women and girls in the Andes are demanding equal access to education, healthcare, and political representation, as well as the elimination of gender-based violence. They are also advocating for the recognition of indigenous women's leadership and the vital role they play in sustaining cultural practices and protecting the environment. One of the key areas of focus for indigenous youth movements is empowering indigenous girls to pursue education and careers in fields where they have traditionally been underrepresented. In countries like Bolivia and Ecuador, young indigenous women are breaking barriers in fields such as science, politics, and social justice. These young women are organizing workshops, leadership programs, and awareness campaigns to challenge gender norms and empower other indigenous girls to pursue their dreams. Indigenous youth organizations in the Andes are also addressing the challenges of intersectional discrimination by advocating for policies that tackle both racial inequality and gender discrimination. They are pushing for greater representation of indigenous women and girls in political decision-making processes, economic development initiatives, and environmental policies. They argue that gender justice and racial justice are essential components of the broader fight for indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. Through their activism, indigenous youth in the Andes are helping to dismantle the multiple layers of oppression faced by their communities, working toward a future in which indigenous peoples, regardless of their gender or race, can live with dignity, equality, and autonomy. Indigenous youth from the Andes are increasingly involved in global climate advocacy, recognizing the importance of aligning local struggles with global climate action. As the impacts of climate change become more pronounced, indigenous youth are making it clear that their communities have long been living with the environmental consequences of global warming, even though they have contributed the least to the problem. From shrinking glaciers to changing weather patterns, indigenous youth in the Andes are deeply affected by the environmental changes that threaten their land, resources, and ways of life. One prominent movement involving indigenous youth is the global climate strikes initiated by Greta Thunberg. Young activists from around the world have joined forces to demand urgent climate action, and indigenous youth from the Andes have made their voices heard in these protests. They bring a unique perspective to the global climate conversation, advocating for the protection of indigenous lands, sustainable agriculture, and the preservation of cultural heritage in the face of ecological destruction. In countries like Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, indigenous youth have participated in Fridays for Future, where they have highlighted the connection between environmental justice and human rights. Indigenous youth in the Andes are pushing for policies that address the disproportionate impact of climate change on marginalized communities. They are advocating for climate justice that includes not only the reduction of carbon emissions, but also the restoration of land rights and the empowerment of indigenous peoples to manage their territories in ways that protect the environment. At the United Nations Climate Change Conferences, COP, Andean youth leaders have demanded that their knowledge of traditional environmental practices be integrated into global climate strategies. The traditional ecological knowledge, TK, that indigenous communities in the Andes have developed over centuries is a crucial part of the solution to global environmental crises. Indigenous youth are calling for the recognition of their communities as knowledge holders, whose sustainable farming methods, water management systems, and forest conservation practices can contribute to climate adaptation and mitigation. One such initiative is the Amazonian Youth Climate Summit, where youth from across the Amazon basin, including the Andes, gather to discuss solutions to climate change and promote indigenous-led environmental policies. These youth-led gatherings provide a platform for young people to share their experiences and collaborate on solutions that respect the rights of indigenous peoples and biodiversity. By organizing around these issues, indigenous youth in the Andes are not only demanding action on climate change, but also ensuring that indigenous communities have a seat at the table in international decision-making processes. In Peru, indigenous youth have also worked to create climate action networks that connect indigenous communities with global environmental organizations. These networks enable the sharing of resources, strategies, and knowledge, while also creating opportunities for young indigenous leaders to participate in the global conversation about climate change. This movement is helping to ensure that Andean indigenous youth are at the forefront of global climate action, promoting policies that protect both the planet and indigenous people's way of life. The intersection of indigenous rights and social justice is increasingly becoming a central focus for indigenous youth in the Andes. While environmental justice is often the most visible aspect of their activism, indigenous youth are also tackling the social injustices faced by their communities, including racism, poverty, lack of political representation, and economic inequality. These issues are deeply interwoven with the broader struggles for land rights and self-determination, as marginalized indigenous peoples continue to face systemic discrimination at all levels of society. In countries like Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, Indigenous youth are working to combat racial discrimination and advocate for more inclusive societies. They're challenging the historical stigmatization of Indigenous peoples as backward or inferior, and pushing for greater recognition of Indigenous contributions to society, both historically and in contemporary times. These youth activists are organizing campaigns and protests to demand equal rights for Indigenous peoples, including the right to education, health care, and political representation. In Bolivia, the plurinational state model, which recognizes Bolivia as a union of indigenous nations, has created opportunities for indigenous youth to advocate for policies that promote racial equality and social inclusion. The election of Evo Morales, the first indigenous president of Bolivia, marked a significant milestone in the fight for racial and social justice. However, challenges remain, and indigenous youth continue to push for stronger policies that ensure economic empowerment and equal opportunities for indigenous peoples. Indigenous youth in the Andes are also addressing gender inequality, which is compounded by both racism and poverty. Indigenous women, in particular, face multiple layers of oppression, and young indigenous women are leading the charge to advocate for gender equality within their communities and beyond. By organizing around issues such as gender-based violence, access to education, and economic independence, indigenous youth are striving to create a more equitable society for all members of their communities. One example of this activism is the work of young indigenous women in Ecuador, who have been organizing against gender-based violence and demanding better access to health care and education. These young women are also calling for greater political representation in national and local governments, ensuring that indigenous women's voices are heard in decision-making processes. Their efforts have been critical in shifting the conversation around indigenous women's rights and gender justice in the Andes, contributing to broader movements for social justice in Latin America. Indigenous youth in the Andes are working to create a future where social justice and racial equality are realized, ensuring that indigenous peoples, particularly women and youth, have the tools and opportunities to thrive in a rapidly changing world. The rise of global solidarity among indigenous youth movements has been one of the most important developments in the fight for indigenous rights in the Andes and beyond. Indigenous youth in the Andes are increasingly recognizing that their struggles for land sovereignty, cultural preservation, environmental justice, and social equity are part of a larger global movement for decolonization, self-determination, and human rights. By building networks of solidarity with other indigenous youth movements worldwide, they're strengthening their capacity to challenge systemic oppression and advocate for the recognition and protection of indigenous peoples' rights. One of the most significant platforms for this global solidarity is the Indigenous Youth Caucus, which brings together young indigenous leaders from around the world to share strategies, collaborate on campaigns, and advocate for policy change. This caucus has been instrumental in amplifying the voices of indigenous youth at international forums, such as the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, UNPFII, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. By participating in these global discussions, indigenous youth from the Andes are ensuring that the concerns of their communities are represented on the world stage. Indigenous youth from the Andes have also been active in the Indigenous Peoples Global Summit on Climate Change, where they have called for the recognition of traditional ecological knowledge and land sovereignty in global climate policies. These youth leaders are pushing for policies that respect indigenous rights, protect the environment, and promote sustainability, ensuring that future generations of indigenous peoples will inherit lands that are protected and valued for their ecological and cultural importance. Solidarity between indigenous youth movements is not limited to environmental issues. Indigenous youth in the Andes are also joining forces with movements advocating for racial justice, gender equality, and economic justice. They are participating in global campaigns such as the Black Lives Matter movement, which addresses issues of racial discrimination and police violence, and feminist movements that fight for the rights of women and girls. By building these cross-movement alliances, Indigenous youth are expanding their impact and ensuring that their voices are heard in broader, global struggles for justice. These global connections are strengthening Indigenous youth activism in the Andes and providing them with a platform to advocate for the rights of Indigenous peoples worldwide. As they continue to push for social and environmental justice, the solidarity of Indigenous youth movements is helping to build a more equitable and sustainable future for all. The struggle for land and resource sovereignty remains one of the most critical battles for Indigenous youth in the Andes. These young activists are confronting both the historical injustices of land dispossession and the modern challenges of resource extraction, which continue to threaten their communities. Indigenous lands, once considered sacred and central to cultural identity, are now increasingly vulnerable to mining, oil extraction, hydroelectric dams, and industrial agriculture. As these industries encroach on Indigenous territories, youth are taking action to defend their rights to the land and natural resources, which are essential not only for their economic survival, but also for the cultural and spiritual well-being of their communities. In Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, Indigenous youth are leading campaigns against the expansion of mining operations in sensitive ecological areas, such as the Andean highlands and the Amazon rainforest. These youth-led efforts aim to halt projects that would lead to the destruction of their environmental heritage, such as water contamination, deforestation, and soil erosion. Mining and oil extraction often threaten Indigenous peoples' access to clean water, fertile land, and their traditional livelihoods, such as agriculture and fishing. In response, youth movements have organized protests, legal challenges, and international campaigns to raise awareness about these environmental and cultural threats. A notable example is the Minas Conga project in Peru, where Indigenous youth played a pivotal role in organizing protests against a proposed gold mining operation. The project was set to divert vital water sources for the local Quechua and Aymara communities, who rely on these resources for both their farming and drinking water. Young leaders in Cajamarca spearheaded efforts to block the project, using both traditional and digital means to mobilize local, national, and international support. Through these actions, Indigenous youth in the region have shown that their commitment to defending the land extends beyond mere survival. It is a fight to protect their cultural identity and the environment for future generations. These youth movements have gained significant momentum in the Andean region, with Indigenous young people increasingly vocal in advocating for the right to free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, when it comes to resource extraction projects. FPIC is a principle enshrined in international law that requires governments and corporations to obtain the explicit consent of Indigenous communities before proceeding with any development that may affect their land or way of life. Indigenous youth are demanding that their communities' rights be respected in all decision-making processes, and they are increasingly using both legal and grassroots methods to hold governments and corporations accountable for violations of these rights. In Bolivia, the plurinational state constitution recognizes the rights of Indigenous peoples to their ancestral lands and natural resources. Indigenous youth in Bolivia have been instrumental in defending these constitutional rights, organizing movements to prevent land dispossession by large agricultural and extractive industries. Through protests, political advocacy, and legal challenges, they are ensuring that their communities retain control over their lands and that the state upholds its obligations to protect their rights. As global demand for natural resources continues to rise, the efforts of indigenous youth in the Andes have taken on greater importance. They are fighting not only for their land, but also for a vision of the future where sustainable development, environmental justice, and cultural preservation are prioritized. The strength and determination of these young activists demonstrate the critical role they play in the broader movement for indigenous rights and environmental sustainability. Education is one of the most powerful tools indigenous youth have in their fight for cultural preservation and self-determination. In the Andes, indigenous communities have long faced barriers to accessing quality education, and many schools have failed to incorporate indigenous languages, traditions, and knowledge systems into their curricula. This lack of representation has led to the erosion of indigenous cultures and the marginalization of indigenous peoples, particularly in rural areas. Indigenous youth in the Andes are now leading efforts to demand inclusive education that honors their cultural identity, language, and history. In Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, young activists are organizing to push for bilingual education programs that incorporate Quechua, Aymara, and other indigenous languages alongside Spanish. They are also advocating for the inclusion of traditional ecological knowledge and cultural practices in school curricula, ensuring that indigenous students are educated about their heritage and have the opportunity to pass it on to future generations. In Bolivia, where the Constitution recognizes Bolivia as a plurinational state, indigenous youth have pushed for reforms that would ensure indigenous people's right to culturally appropriate education. These reforms include the establishment of schools that provide bilingual education in indigenous languages and Spanish, and that incorporate Andean traditions and ecological knowledge into the teaching. Youth activists in Bolivia have successfully campaigned for the creation of indigenous universities that are designed to serve the needs of indigenous communities and promote cultural pride. The movement for culturally relevant education has also gained traction in Ecuador, where indigenous youth are pushing for schools to teach indigenous history, traditional farming techniques, and sustainable development. Indigenous youth in the Amazon region, for example, have been advocating for the inclusion of Amazonian ecological knowledge in national education policies. These efforts are crucial in ensuring that indigenous students grow up with an understanding of their cultural heritage and are equipped to advocate for their rights in a rapidly changing world. In addition to advocating for formal education reforms, indigenous youth in the Andes are also working to create alternative educational spaces that teach indigenous languages, traditions, and environmental stewardship. Youth-led schools, cultural centers, and workshops are being established in Andean communities to preserve indigenous knowledge and pass it on to younger generations. These grassroots initiatives are not just about preserving language and culture. They're also about empowering indigenous youth to take on leadership roles in their communities and beyond. Indigenous youth in the Andes understand that education is a crucial tool for their community's survival, both culturally and politically. By advocating for inclusive education that reflects their identities and values, they are ensuring that the next generation of indigenous leaders is equipped to fight for their rights and protect their environment. The rise of indigenous youth movements in the Andes has not only transformed local activism, but has also had a profound impact on the global indigenous rights movement. Young leaders from the Andes are increasingly playing a central role in advocating for environmental justice, cultural preservation, and indigenous sovereignty, both within their communities and on the global stage. Their actions are helping to shape the broader discourse on climate change, indigenous rights, and social justice. As the world faces mounting environmental challenges, the leadership of indigenous youth in the Andes has become more crucial than ever. These young leaders are uniquely positioned to bring together traditional ecological knowledge and modern science to address issues such as deforestation, biodiversity loss, and climate change. They are advocating for policies that prioritize sustainability and equitable development, ensuring that the rights of indigenous peoples are respected in national and international decision-making processes. The increasing visibility of Andean indigenous youth in global forums, such as the United Nations Climate Change Conferences, COP, and the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, UNPFII, has given them a platform to advocate for climate justice and human rights. Their efforts have helped to elevate indigenous voices in the global conversation about environmental sustainability and have ensured that indigenous knowledge is recognized as an integral part of global climate solutions. Through their activism, indigenous youth in the Andes are helping to dismantle the systems of colonialism, neoliberalism, and racial inequality that have long marginalized their communities. They are reclaiming their heritage, empowering their communities, and challenging the status quo to create a future where indigenous peoples can thrive and live in harmony with the environment. As these youth-led movements continue to grow and gain strength, there is hope for a future where indigenous rights, environmental justice, and cultural preservation are no longer marginalized, but are at the heart of global conversations about sustainable development and social equity. The leadership of indigenous youth in the Andes is shaping a new path forward, one that values the rights of indigenous peoples and the protection of the earth for generations to come. So, what did we learn today? From the preservation of ancient knowledge to the fierce defense of their land and rights. Indigenous youth in the Andes are the heartbeat of a movement that will shape the future. Their fight is not just for their own communities. It's a fight for the planet, for justice, and for the very survival of their cultures. The moral of today's story is clear. Resilience, unity, and the power of young voices can bring about significant change. And they're not only fighting for the past, they are fighting for the future. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through history. If you found inspiration in the stories of these young leaders, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to History Teller YT for more riveting histories that continue to shape our world. We'll be back soon with more tales from the past and present, so make sure to stay tuned for our next exploration.